good leadership and rulership should be for following kings. In fact, it's said that the Shah of Iran, if you remember him, in the 1970s, actually cited that clay cylinder and claimed that his leadership was going to mirror Cyrus the Great's. And then he was promptly ousted for being crooked. But nonetheless, he is still someone that, in that part of the world, is highly revered. He was Iranian, what is today Iran. So he was Persian. He was but a good king. Anyway, God uses him to set the Israelites free. Names him by name through the prophet Isaiah in 700 BC, even though Cyrus wouldn't be born for another 150 years. So when Cyrus comes into Babylon, the Jews bring him Isaiah's scroll, Isaiah's prophecy. They say, look, you're named by name by our prophet. And in fact, God actually calls Cyrus his anointed one. So look, our God says you're his anointed one to save his people. Named you 150 years ago by name. And Cyrus was so impressed with the fact that the God of the Israelites named him and knew him and called him his anointed one, that he set the Israelites free. And more than set them free, he made them rich on their way out of town. He restored all the stuff that the Chaldeans stole out of the temple, sent it back with them. So, all right, so now we come to this. That's the setup. This is Ezra. Ezra was a priest who lived at the time when all this was happening. He was one of the exiles, so he saw Cyrus capturing Babylon, and he came back with the captives to rebuild Jerusalem after Cyrus set them free. So last week we read through verse 4 of Ezra 1. Verses 2, 3, and 4 are Cyrus's decree as the king of Persia, how he's going to set his people, set the Jerusalem, the Jews free to go back to Jerusalem. So we'll pick it up in verse 5, which corresponds to your handout. Now, you're going to see why, but we're going to skip some large portions of this as we read it. But verse 5, then the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, and all those whose spirits God had moved, arose to go up and build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. Now, verse 5 on the handout. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Again, these are the only two tribes named. And the reason is because those are the only two tribes left out of the 12. So the old 10 tribes are gone by this point in time, no longer exist. So they're named, and then it says they went up to rebuild the house of the Lord, and mark that and kind of tuck that away for a little bit, because we're going to talk about that. Verse 6, and all those who were around them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, with precious things, besides all that was willingly offered. See, it's almost like they're sacking Babylon. Cyrus encourages everybody to give to him on the way out of town. So they enrich them. And it sounds like even their unbelieving neighbors, all those who were around them, not just the fellow Jews. And not all the Jews went. There were several waves that went from Babylon back to Jerusalem. Not all the Jews went in the first or second waves. Some of them stayed in Babylon. So the first wave went loaded down with all of these riches, which would have made them a target to anybody except for the fact that they had Cyrus's protection. So nobody dared attack them and rob them along the way, or they'd have had the wrath of Cyrus on their hands. So, yeah, compare that with their exodus out of Egypt, where they had to leave everything behind and run for their lives. This time they're given everything and protected along the way. Verse 7, King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, brought them out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. This is the number of them. Okay, now, something about Ezra. Ezra was a priest. And he was, almost seems to be like a priest/accountant. Because a lot of Ezra is accounting stuff. It's numbers. Ezra is big into numbers and lists. So we're going to see chapter after chapter of numbers and lists. And this is why people don't read Ezra. Because it's hard to see the point. Why? What good is it for us to know all the numbers and lists? Well, we'll talk a little bit about what's in that for us. But you're about to see some numbers and lists. So verse 9, this is the number of them. 30 gold platters, 1,000 silver platters, 29 knives, 30 gold basins, 410 silver basins of similar kind, and 1,000 other articles. And the articles of gold and silver were 5,400. All these Sheshbazzar took with the captives who were brought from Babylon to Jerusalem. That's a lot of stuff that's worth a fortune that Cyrus just hands over to the Jews. Take it with you. Go. Again, every other ruler and conqueror, the reason you sack a city is to take all its wealth as your own and build your own kingdom up. It's not the way Cyrus worked. He sacked a city and then gave the richest part of it to some other people that he sent away. It's nothing short of miraculous that God raised up a ruler with that kind of mindset at that point in history. He wasn't a good accountant. Well, maybe they're listing the important parts and that everything altogether was 5,400 if you added the non-important things to them. I don't know. There's another problem in that Ezra's lists that we're going to see in chapter 2, Nehemiah makes the same list, and they don't agree completely. Now, why they don't agree, I'm not entirely sure. But there's a reason. They're not wrong. It's just one lists certain names and one lists a few of the others, and there were probably some insignificant names that one listed that the other passed over because it really wasn't significant. And maybe that's what Ezra is doing too. He's hitting the high points. So, yeah, to see what happened to the rest. This is what's left, by the way. After 70 years of having been carted out of Jerusalem, literally carted out on ox carts 900 miles from Jerusalem to Babylon, stuck in the false temples to the false gods of Babylon for 70 years, and then Cyrus is sacking the false gods of Babylon, taking back God's stuff and sending it on. What happened to the rest of the stuff in the old temple, we actually know in 2 Kings. This is just the stuff that's left, and there's still a lot of it left after 70 years. In 2 Kings 24, we're told what happens to the stuff that isn't left, and it's kind of heartbreaking. 2 Kings 24, 13 to 16. And this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar's sack of Jerusalem. And he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, carried out from there, that is the temple of God, all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he cut in pieces all the articles of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. So there's what happens to the majority of some of the most beautiful stuff ever made out of gold. Nebuchadnezzar hacks it up. Probably because it was too big and heavy to move from Jerusalem to Babylon, 900 miles. They had to make it manageable. So what the Israelites get back does not match the glory of what was once there. And the new temple that they're going to build is not going to match the glory of Solomon's temple. All right, next point. A guy in this reading verse, let's see, it was 8, Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Sheshbazzar, I think that's kind of a Babylonian name. That's not really a Jewish name. But he's a prince of Judah. So again, this is Cyrus's method of operation. He chooses someone from among the people to be his governor, his mediator between him and the conquered people. He chose Sheshbazzar, who was a prince in some sense in Judah. And he is the one he's dealing with now on behalf of the Israelites. It's a little uncertain whether this Sheshbazzar is the same guy as another guy named a little while later called Zerubbabel. They might be the same guy, they might not be, it's hard to tell. But Sheshbazzar, he's called the governor of Judah in Ezra 5. In Haggai chapter 1, it called Zerubbabel a governor of Israel at this point. That's why it's difficult to know if this is the same guy or two different guys. So, and then on the handout, here's a timeline. Just a brief one. 539, Babylon is conquered by the Medes and Persians. 538, and you count down because we're counting to 0 from BC. Cyrus's first year as emperor in Babylon. 537, return of the first wave of exiles under Sheshbazzar. And then the following year, 536, work on the temple finally begins. So, all right, that's chapter 1. We're not going to read all of chapter 2. We'll read some of it. So, chapter 2, verse 1. Now, these are the people of the province who came back from the captivity, of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah, everyone to his own city. All right, so that gives us some information about how they're going to do this. Everyone to his own city. They're not just all coming back and diving into Jerusalem and living there. They're going back to the cities they came from. And the way cities worked then, they didn't have the mobility we have. You usually lived and died in the same place you were born. There wasn't a lot of moving around from city to city. So cities tended to be family units. Roughly, loosely family units. I'm sure there were some people moving in and out. But when you see a name of a city, sometimes it's also the name of the first person who lived there. They name the cities after them. So some of the cities are named after families. So it's difficult to kind of tease out which are families he's talking about and which are cities he's talking about. But it does say in verse 1, this business of cities, that they're returning to their own city, and that's where they're settling. So, just a little bit into this. Verse 2, those who came with Zerubbabel. See, now there we get Zerubbabel, and before we had Sheshbazzar. So either two different people who are acting as governors or the same guy, hard to tell. And it wouldn't at all be unusual for one guy to have more than one name. That too is typical at this point. He would have had a Babylonian name that he would have been known by, and he would have had an Israelite name he would have been known by. Not at all unusual. So it could be the same guy. Those who came with Zerubbabel were, and then we get Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mizpar, Bigvai, Reham, and Banana. The number of men, he was probably teased mercilessly as a child. Poor Banana. The name of the men of the people of Israel. This is the only time that the important guys, individuals, are named. From here on out, it's all families and tribes. Verses 3 to 35, which we're not going to read all of, but just a taste from verse 3. The people of Parash, there's a city, 2,172. The people of Shephatiah, 372. The people of Ara, 700, and then on and on. The people of, all these different cities, and naming how many are going to live there. Some of these are Well, actually, all of these are really pretty pathetic when you think of the population of Israel, and million probably in the southern kingdom when it was carted off into slavery, and now you're getting 100 and something back to this town, 300-400 back to that town. It's a pittance. It's truly a remnant. It's less than 10%. It's a tiny little group that's going back home. So all of these numbers, all of these families laid out there, there's a total of 40 family names or city names, depending on which it is, listed here in these verses through verse 39. Then in verse 40, actually, verse 36, we get priests. That's through verse 35, there's 40. In verse 36, we get the priests listed. The sons of Jedediah of the house of Jeshua, 973. That Jeshua, had his name back in verse 2, Jeshua. So he evidently was the patriarch of the priestly class. 973. Now there's actually quite a bit of priests, quite a good number of them. 900 there, 1,052 in the next one, 1,200 in the next one. 1,000, so we've got like 4,000 priests going back. Then verse 40, we get the Levites listed. Not a lot of them, 74. Priests and Levites were the same tribe. Priests had to come from the tribe of Levi. So why would you separate priests and Levites? Because really they're all Levites. The priests served in the temple, and in order to be a priest, you had to have a certain criteria. I mean, you had to be male. You had to be serving between certain ages. Retirement age for priest was either 50 or 55. I'd be retired if I were an Old Testament priest. They retired you to your own little farm. The Levites actually didn't have lands of their own per se. They were given land as a gift for their service in the temple.
Do you think Ezra kept all these numbers maybe because he considered himself a historian of the tribe?
That is one option. Yeah. This was important history that people need to know, so he was going to keep it. We'll talk a little bit about what all these numbers mean here at the end of this. So I'm going to get there. The priests also were the ones who did the sacrificial work. They were the ones in charge of the sacrifices and making the sacrifices and going into the holy place to do it. Nobody else could do that, only the priests. So there are 4,000 priests going out of a group of 40-something thousand. So roughly 10% of this group going back are priests. That's a pretty significant number. All right, and then 74 remaining Levites. Verse 41, they brought the choir with them, the singers. The sons of Asaph, 128. So they had a 128-strong male choir they took back with them. Then 42, sons of the gatekeepers. These two, when it says gatekeepers, that's not city gate it's talking about. That's temple gate it's talking about. The gatekeepers' duties are laid out for us in 1 Chronicles. You don't necessarily have to look it up. But the gatekeepers were the guys who were in charge of the treasury, all the money coming in. They were in charge of all the articles in the temple, keeping everything clean and upkeep, cleaning. They determined who got into the temple and who didn't. The temple had gates on 4 sides. It had a wall around it and then gates on 4 sides. The gatekeepers lived outside those gates on all 4 sides. Nobody got to the temple without going past the gatekeepers. And they made sure you were an Israelite, a Jew. Only Jews were allowed in the temple complex. So they were kind of like the bouncers of the temple, and the janitors, and the trustees, and the treasurers. So they had a lot of responsibility for keeping the temple. So they were an important group for temple upkeep. And there are there are a pile of them too. 139 of those. Sons, yeah. So all of the people listed so far are temple people. Verse 43 and to 54, again, just verse 43, then Nethanim, the son of Ziha, the sons of Hasupha, got myself into something, etc. It says verse 43, yeah, then it'll go down a little further. Where are we here? Eventually it comes to the temple servants, sons of gatekeepers, sons. Yeah, at verse 55, the sons of Solomon's servants, the sons of etc., etc. These are temple workers there too, those lists. Kind of more upkeep type stuff. Verse 59, this final group, verse 59, these were the ones who came up from Tel Melah, etc., etc., but they could not identify their father's house or their genealogy, whether they were of Israel. And then it lists them. So, if you could not delineate your lineage clearly, that is, father, son, father, son, father, son, back to the original 12 tribes, you were not considered part of the children of Israel. If you forgot it, tough luck. You were out of the children of Israel. You were not considered officially a Jew. And a lot of this stuff wasn't written down. It was all oral tradition. They had to memorize this from little on, who father and son was, going back. Let's see, this is 500. The 12 tribes would have been 1200 BC. 700 years of family lineage you had to memorize. And if you forgot a section, you're out. This last group could not remember their section. They lost some of their genealogy. But they were allowed to go along with the group. They still considered them unofficial Israelites, it seems. They still got to go with the group and be part of the people of God. But in terms of any service in the temple, automatically excluded. If you couldn't trace yourself back to Levi, clearly you weren't a Levite. So they were excluded from the service that was rightly theirs if they could have identified their lineage properly. All right, now let's kind of look at the big picture of all of these lists and of people. First of all, why? What in the world would be the purpose of detailing a list of everybody who goes and how many? One, as Chet mentioned, maybe this is just historical record keeping, so future generations know the story. But for the Jews, it's bigger than this. We don't get it because their mindset and our mindset start in two different places. The Jews did not consider the individual. We consider individual first and foremost. The individual is the center of our American universe. The Jews, the tribe was the center of their universe because the tribe marked you as a people of God, and that meant salvation. We are so individually driven in our culture, we can't appreciate the importance of a tribal mindset. Why list all of these names and peoples right down to the number? Because this is going to help people establish their salvation. Children are going to be able to look back, name their fathers and their heritage, tell the story of this returning back from exile, and guarantee that, yes, I am part of the people of God and therefore I'm saved. That's the first thing. The second part is the Jews were still waiting for the Messiah. They didn't know when the Messiah was going to come. This kind of record keeping was going to help establish a messianic line. They knew the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah. They knew he would come from the family of David. The prophets told them this. So they kept these records as well so that they could establish clearly who the Messiah was when he showed up, if he met the criteria that God set up in terms of genealogy. And of course, when finally confronted with that and Jesus met the criteria, they still choose to ignore him. So the messianic thing and the tribal thing are hugely important to the Jews, and part of why we keep this detailed list of numbers and names and all of that. To them, this was the documentation of salvation, both in terms of Messiah and their being part of the people of God. Next, note the large percentage of the people listed who are connected to the temple. So what does it say about how the Jews valued people when they're listed according to family and not according to tribes or trades? Now, first of all, just think of what they're going to do when they go back. They're going to rebuild Jerusalem. But the first wave is over 10% priestly class, and probably another 10% connected directly to the upkeep and maintenance of the temple. So a good 20% of the first wave are all connected to the temple. They're specifically mentioned. But if you're going to rebuild a city that's been flattened, who do you want to take? Your tradesmen. Yeah, you want to take your carpenters, your masons, your electricians and plumbers. You know, you want to take the guys who are going to be able to rebuild. But I'm sure that's who they were taking. They were taking them largely from the priestly class. I'm sure these guys that were going along weren't just priests. They had to be skilled in rebuilding, in construction. So you would take your construction workers with you. But they're not listed by trade. They're listed only, the only trade, if you want to even call it that, that's listed, is the connected to the temple. So what does that tell you about priorities? The reason the Israelites were carted off into slavery in the first place was because of their false worship. So now that they're coming back out of slavery, it took 70 years, but they seem to have learned the lesson. God first, everything else second. And the right worship of God, not just the worship of a God. So when they come back, their focus is single-minded. We're going to get the worship of God right. And we're bringing the whole priestly class with us when we do it. You know, they wanted to fix the problems that got them carted off in the first place. So it actually speaks well of the fact that they learned something during these 70 years of captivity. And they had prophets, by the way. While they were captives in Babylon, they had prophets teaching them this. Daniel was alive in Babylon, teaching the Israelites about the faith that they had forsaken. Haggai was alive. You had Ezra and Nehemiah, both alive. They had a number of prophets teaching them and ministering to them. And it seems to have worked. It took 70 years, but it worked. And now when they're going back, God is first, above everything else. All right, verse 64 to 70, well, 64 to 67 especially, tells you the rest of it. Yeah, the whole congregation, 42,360. Besides their male and female servants, so it was even bigger than that, who were 7,300. So you've got a 50,000 strong group, 200 men and women singers. There's another choir. And now the animal list. This is also interesting. 66. Their horses were 700. Their mules were 200. Their camels were 400. Their donkeys were 6,000. What kinds of animals are those? And what kind aren't they? Well, there's no dogs, yeah. Dogs were dirty animals to the Jews. They would not have dogs like we have dogs. They weren't dog people. They were cat people. They weren't dog people.
They were pack animals, not the ones they'd sacrifice.
They're work animals, right? These are all work animals. They are not sacrificial animals. They're not the kind of livestock you live from. You know, there's no, unless you drink camel milk, I don't know, but there's no goats, there's no sheep. That was really the staple of their livelihood, was those kinds of animals, and they're not bringing them. So again, what does it say about their mindset? They're going back to work. Even their animals they're taking along are all work animals. So where are they going to get the animals for the sacrifice and the livestock and all of that? Well, verse 69, according to their ability, they gave to the treasury for the work 61,000 gold drachmas, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. So they all chip in on top of going back. They all chip in, and the stuff that they were given when they left, it's a substantial sum. A mina and a drachma are the two given. I did a little research. A drachma was in 300 BC, and this is 500 BC, so it's a little earlier. But nonetheless, in 300 BC, a gold drachma was the cost of a sheep. They had 61,000 gold drachma. They could have bought a pretty decent flock with that. So they were going to use this money for temple materials and probably the other things they would need. And then a mina was about 3 months' wages. That's a huge amount. 1/60th of a talent is 70 pounds, so a little over a pound of silver is a mina, 3 months' wages, and they've got 5,000 of them. And then consider the fact they had priestly garments. They had been keeping these things in storage for 70 years, just waiting for this. And they had 100 of them still left. So you've got a pretty substantial operating fund to deal with. What do they do with it? How are we on time? We're good. They're going to use it to rebuild the temple. So they use it in service to God, not self. Verse 70, the last verse of chapter 2. So the priests, Levites, some of the people, singers, gatekeepers, and the Nethanim, I think those are the servants of Solomon, dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. So when they get back, the first order of business, go to Jerusalem, get to work, but they also have the support group around them that seems to go back and settle in their old historic areas, which are rubble by this time. When it says go back to your city, it's a pit. They've been sacked. Jerusalem is a pit. What's left of the temple at this point is just a rubble field. Jerusalem was burned to the ground. 70 years later, I'm sure there was still, heaps of ash and half-burned wood laying around. It would have been a disaster. Any comments before we look at chapter 3?
Nothing gets built until the temple.
Nothing gets built until the temple, that's right. And even before then, chapter 3, we'll see that they don't actually build a temple first. They build the altar first, which is also significant. Chapter 3, verse 1, and when this 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in the cities, and the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. 7th month. I'm not sure it tells us what month they left. But Babylon to Jerusalem, roughly 500 miles, or 900 miles for a caravan trip. 50,000 human beings in tow, thousands of animals. Imagine the logistical nightmare of moving a group that big 900 miles through mountains. And the amount of time it would have taken. This was a trek that the elderly might not have been able to make. This would have taken months to finally get there. And food and drink for all of those animals and all those people every single day, the massive scale of that is truly an amazing thing. So anyway, verse 1, they gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. What do you think that means? The people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. Single-mindedness, maybe? They're gathered together as one man. They're of one mind, one heart. They're all ready to do the one thing that they came there to do. So there's no disagreement, no arguing and bickering among them about what we should be doing. They're there as under one game plan that they're all committed to. And again, the meaninglessness of individuality in the Jewish mindset. Verse 2, then Jeshua the son of Jozadak and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and the brethren arose and built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. First order of business, build the altar. Not the temple, the altar. They build the altar before they've even laid the foundation for the temple. They had to start from the foundation. The Babylonians destroyed the temple to that extent that they even broke up the foundation. But they build the altar first. So again, what does that say? God first. Not a building first. And grace first. Because that altar is where they offered sacrifices that would atone for their sin. That's where blood was going to be shed so that God would forgive them. Offering sacrifices for these people was their sacrament. This was the thing through which God worked in order to forgive them their sins. So that's first. It's really a very meaningful thing that they build that altar first. They understand the importance of grace in their lives. Not just having a big, beautiful building, but forgiveness. And then verse 3, though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries, they set the altar on its bases, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening burnt offerings. And they also kept the Feast of Tabernacles, as it's written, to offer the daily burnt offerings in the number required by the ordinance for each day. Consider for a moment again the sacrifice needed for that. They had just come 900 miles. By the end of getting there, you can bet things were pretty scarce. They didn't have much of anything. They didn't have flocks. They brought work animals with them. They were dirt poor, having to rebuild from nothing. And they took what precious little they had and offered it up as a burnt offering. They didn't bring sheep with them, but they had to offer sheep day and night. So where do they get them from? Well, people would buy them. Maybe some of their Jewish friends still had sheep there. They did leave that when the Babylonians took away the Israelites 70 years earlier, they left the farmers and the poor people. So there were undoubtedly still Jewish farmers around with sheep. But they were going to rebuild a whole country. They needed every last one of them, but they sacrificed them. That is sacrifice. And it's also an important lesson about the nature of what sacrifice is supposed to be. It's supposed to hurt. You're supposed to miss it, not just give to God what you can afford and, what you're not going to miss. These were essential articles for these people to rebuild, and they were giving them up to offer to God. All right, time. Any thoughts, any comments, any questions?
I have a question.
Okay.